Okay, first of all, I have to say a huge thank you to Geri for inviting me to speak here, and to Geri, the rest of the organisers, and the university for hosting the conference. And the facilities are fantastic. It's really good to be here. Monique and I were just reflecting yesterday that the last time we were in Budapest for an ATI conference, we were in a hotel. And it's always much better, I think, to be in a university where teacher education happens, and to feel that you are surrounded by teacher educators and by student teachers and by teachers who were perhaps students here in their past. So thanks very much, Geri, for the invite and for the hosting. Like Geri, I have a huge debt to the RDC for Social Justice, Equity and Diversity, which I joined many years ago when the ATI conference came to Glasgow. And both the organisation and the research and development community have been a huge help in my career as well. As Geri said, it is the research and development community on social justice, equity and diversity that's organising this conference. I feel particularly proud to be here and speaking to you. We have had in the past a special edition of the European Journal of Teacher Education, which focused on social justice, equity and diversity in teacher education. And later this year, possibly in time for the Braga conference, but maybe a bit later in September, there's going to be a new book published by Trenton Press with the same title as my talk today, Methodologies for Researching with Linguistically and Culturally Diverse School Populations. And that book is also a result of this research and development community, with chapters, international chapters from members of the RDC writing about research practices with linguistically and culturally diverse school populations. So some of what I'm saying today will be in my chapter in that book. Some of it will be reflected in the editorial of the book. That was the advert. Now for the outline of what I'm going to talk about. I'm focusing, as you see, on linguistic and cultural diversity today, although the RDC focuses on a whole range of diversities. And I do want to mention that in my talk today, the intersectionality of diversities. But I want to talk specifically about linguistically and culturally diverse school populations, because that has been where most of my research has been placed. And I want to start by saying, well, why is there so much research with linguistically and culturally diverse school populations? It's absolutely fantastic to see the audience that have come here from so many different countries that are all doing research with similar school populations to what I am myself. And that always makes me feel part of a much bigger community. And it is really, really beneficial for our research. But I wonder why there is so much research around pupils who are linguistically and culturally diverse. And I want to address what are some of the issues, what are some of the barriers to research with such school populations, and what can we learn from other professions outside teaching and outside the discipline of education. And then I want to show you, by drawing on 3 of my own research projects, attempts to address some of the issues that I've mentioned. And then to consider how intersectionality can perhaps enhance our analysis and enhance our methodology. And I want to finish by coming to the beginnings of a model for considering ethical and culturally responsive research with such linguistically and culturally diverse school populations. So why is there so much research with these populations? Well, I think one of the reasons is it is very newsworthy. And certainly occasionally in this talk, I may use the word the UK, the United Kingdom. It's not a word that I use very often. I don't describe myself as coming from the UK, and I'm sorry, I should have said at the start where I do come from. I'm from the University of Strathclyde, which is in Glasgow, which is in Scotland, and I describe myself as coming from Scotland. And there are a large number of differences between the Scottish education system and what is sometimes erroneously termed the UK education system, which is actually the English predominantly and also Welsh education system. I will sometimes use the UK, but I will be very careful about whether I'm using UK or Scotland. And I see some of my Irish colleagues nodding in recognition here, because I'm sure they suffer from some of the similar mistakes that can be made. You can open up the press across the UK, and you can watch the UK television, and I would say on just about a daily basis, issues to do with linguistic, cultural and ethnic diversity are in the news. It's not something, that's why one of the reasons there is so much research in this area. It is newsworthy, it's always there. If you look at the news, it's very often in the UK linked to immigration. So it can be horror stories about immigration, words like being swamped are often used. Words like a wave of immigration are often used. So it's frequently negative stories about immigration. At this point, I am going to say a bit about Scotland, which would differentiate itself from the UK government. And Scotland has a very, very positive orientation towards immigration, because we're a country that is declining in population and we need migrants. I'll also say, and I can't avoid saying, in 2014 that in September there will be a referendum in Scotland for independence, and it may be something that people want to talk to me about later, because I have a very particular position about that, towards that referendum. However, linguistic, ethnic and cultural diversity is in the news, often linked to immigration. Where it is in the educational press, it's frequently linked to the need for teachers to adjust their pedagogy to meet the needs of migrant learners. It's about what a teacher is going to do, what actions can teachers take, how often are teachers going to cope with linguistic and cultural diversity in the classrooms. Scotland is historically a country of migration, although mostly it's been outward migration. But that's not to say that migration inwards is a recent phenomenon. There's historical evidence of migration to Scotland from the Huguenots fleeing persecution in France in the 15th, 16th century. So it's not a new phenomenon, but if you looked at the media, it sometimes suggests it's new, and that teachers don't know how to deal with diversity. And the third thing that the media covers in relation to linguistic and cultural diversity in the classrooms tends to be assessment, and it tends to be about failure. It tends to be about migrant pupils not succeeding, about pupils who don't have English, which is the dominant language of education in Scotland, not managing to achieve. So again, it's connected with teachers' need to adapt. So it's in the news, but it's definitely also there in the research. And I can look at my own journal, the European Journal of Teacher Education, but also other journals that I'm on the editorial board of and other journals that I read. And again, in nearly every issue of educational, teacher education and other branches of education, in nearly every issue of the journals, there are articles that are related to linguistic and cultural diversity. Very frequently, again, as with media coverage, they're linked to assessment, and they're linked to the differences in performance, the differences in achievement of linguistic and cultural minorities. They're also linked to journal articles linked to teachers' views about diversity and to student teachers' views about diversity. And again, linked to pedagogy and linked to teachers' needs to adapt and change their pedagogy to meet the changing classroom. It's also very clearly in the policy, and the OECD was mentioned in a number of sessions yesterday, and the OECD have done reviews of migrant education. Their review is called Closing the Gap for Immigrant Students, Policies, Practice and Performance. Some of you will be aware of the OECD report, which investigated 9 countries' responses to linguistic and cultural diversity, and then made their recommendations for what countries needed to be doing to close the gap. I'm not going to go into a critique of that today, but suffice to say that again they were focusing on teacher actions. They were not focusing on structural change. They were not focusing on the existence of racism for pupils from linguistic and ethnic minorities. They were looking purely at what can teachers do. Let's put the blame on teachers. Let's put the focus on teachers. Let's make sure that there's language support and intercultural education. Again, I'm not going to go into a critique today of intercultural education. I know that many of the papers that are being presented here are looking at that, and I think it's a very important policy to critique what is this thing called intercultural education that's somehow going to make everything better for linguistic and cultural minorities. The OECD recommend making sure that teachers and school leaders can be more responsive to the growing linguistic and cultural diversity without getting at what the systemic racism is that actually affects the pupils that are being talked about, and seems to just focus on, let's make sure that they can speak the language of education and everything will be all right. And while we're going along, we may have a little bit of consideration of other cultural practices. How does that filter down into what happens in different countries? Well, I've put a couple of quotes there from Scottish educational policy as a result of the OECD policy. And again, other people are going to be looking at how homogenised the language of educational policy has become across the globe, and the way in which the OECD language can be seen in the policies of education across the globe. Nothing is new, nothing is linked only to one country. It all stems from the one particular area. So HMIE, that first quote, is Her Majesty's Inspectorate for Education, which is what the UK calls the body that oversees the educational policy in the country. And you can see there that what HMIE are saying is we welcome and celebrate diversity, but that's the end of it. But we need to make sure that there's not any barriers to participation.
Can't see this.
Oh,
So
sorry.
something happens.
I'm showing you all these slides and you're not seeing them.
I don't know what happened. Can you help? Nem látszik a monitoron az előtt. I just realized that it seems that you are using other slides too.
I'm purposely using slides as visual aids to people whose first language isn't English, so my apologies that for some reason technology has let me down.
Jó, menjünk vissza, mert hogy jó, innen, majd oda fog menni, ahol kell neki. Jó. Okay. Sorry.
That was the one that I was just talking about. I'm really sorry about that. If anybody wants the slides, I think they're going to be on the website, so you will be able to see them after the fact, even if you've not seen all of them today. If I seem to be talking about something that isn't on the slide that's there, please could somebody shout and let me know that it's not working, because it's working here and I'm just assuming you're seeing the same as I am. Sorry. Yeah, I'll go back to that one. So then in response to what the OECD were saying about closing the gap, the second quote there, or the bottom quote on the slide there, is the Scottish Government's response to that, where at last the word race is mentioned, rather than just ethnicity or culture, which seemed to be a cover-up for issues of race. And the Scottish Government acknowledging that race and other areas of social identity have the potential to disadvantage pupils, and that issues of social identity need to be given consideration to make sure that all pupils can access the curriculum, no matter what their background is. It's also then in the policy in terms of teacher standards, or at least it is in some countries. I did a talk at the British Educational Research Association last year about the new teacher standards in England and Wales. My jaw dropped when I saw the new teacher education standards in England and Wales. I'm looking here at Alistair, who's nodding in recognition, because if you are a teacher in England and Wales, you are expected to not undermine fundamental British values. Again, I could spend a whole hour critiquing that term, as I did at the BIRA conference. But one of the important things to say about that term is that it actually comes directly from the UK government's anti-terrorist legislation. And teachers are basically, in the new teacher standards in England and Wales, being asked to spy on their pupils, being asked to make sure that none of their pupils are doing anything that might be deemed to undermine so-called fundamental British values. One of the fundamental British values that are specified in the teacher education standards is a word which I have a particular despair of, and that is tolerance. And so the talk that I was doing at BIRA last year was called Being Intolerant About Tolerance, and again is something else that I'd be quite happy to enter into discussions with people over the conference, because I think it's a word that is sometimes used without giving any real thought to what it means. In Scotland, and one of my English colleagues said to me recently that she had values envy, or standards envy, and wished that in England teachers could have this as their professional value. The Scottish teacher education standards indicate that the professional values and personal commitment core to being a teacher are social justice. Now, I'm not saying that is, right, that's it, that's brilliant, we've done it, but it's an awful lot better than don't undermine fundamental British values, but have social justice at the core of your professional values and your personal commitment. And in Northern Ireland, so I'm only here looking at the teacher standards in the UK. In Northern Ireland, the core values of the profession are spelled out: trust, honesty, commitment, respect, fairness, equality, integrity. There we have that, tolerance again, and service. So this is, again, me setting the scene for, well, why is there so much research on linguistic and culturally diverse pupil populations? What's going on? What is it in the news, in the research, and in the policy that means people think that this is a valid area for investigation and for research? And certainly in teacher education, it is an area of research. As I said, it's in the teacher standards. Social justice in Scotland is part of undergraduate course content to look at linguistic and ethnic diversity. There is a placement focus on looking at diversity, so students are expected to engage with community organisations that have a focus on diversity. Many undergraduate dissertations are written in this area, as are master's dissertations, and local authorities in Scotland are calling for continuing professional development on responses to linguistic and ethnic diversity. Lots of action research being done in schools by teachers. And for those of you that were here last night, I grouped myself with the collaborative research because I think we need to be working as communities of research, working teachers, teacher educators, educational academics together to build research, and many doctoral theses from teacher education in this area. So it's definitely important, it's there. Teacher education responses in Scotland, in my own institution, which is one of the biggest teacher education institutions in Europe, our focus on linguistic and cultural diversity in the 80s, 70s, into the early 80s was a focus on multicultural education, sometimes called the 3 S's, saris, samosas and steel bands. A focus on let's think about celebration, let's think about difference. And it led to complacency. As long as we say a little bit about how people, other than the hegemonic majority, celebrate, then we're doing fine. We're actually covering it. But there was a move in the 1980s and through the 90s into an anti-racist education. And it was coined by Troyna and Williams rather than the 3 S's, has been the 3 R's. It's a time of resistance, rejection and rebellion, where racism was very firmly placed on the agenda, and it was seen that racism was part of the daily educational experience of children from linguistic and ethnic minorities. And at that time, at my institution, we had an explicit interdisciplinary and compulsory module for all our students. So not only our teachers, but our social workers, community workers, speech and language therapists, psychologists, sports educators worked together on a module on social justice in professional contexts. It was a good time, but guess what? It's been cut. It no longer exists. We no longer work interprofessionally. We no longer have that focus on social justice made explicit. Rather, we are now expected to have social justice embedded in our values and in our approach to teacher education. And my concern is that the result of that has been not embedded social justice, but rather invisibility of social justice, a complete flattening and homogenizing of the arena, which leaves the media and the policy to dictate what teachers' views are, rather than the research coming from the academics in the institution. So I've tried to point out that there is a rationale for there being a lot of research with minority, linguistic and ethnic communities in schools. And I want to just say a little bit about who are the researchers then, who are the people that are doing those dissertations, those theses, that action research. And across Europe and in fact much of the Western world, the teachers, the teacher education students, the teacher educators, the education academics are predominantly white. And just have to look at who's in the audience here today. Predominantly white. And predominantly, they are first language speakers of the dominant language of the country. And yet the people that are being researched, and I'm talking mostly about pupils today, I'll also talk about teachers, and then I'll end up with the second advert. First advert was for a book. The advert at the end, and this is just to remind me, is for a conference that's coming up. The people that are being researched here, the immigrant pupils, the minority ethnic, the linguistic minority pupils, then are differing quite clearly from the researchers in terms of ethnicity, culture, first language use, often also in social class, because the majority of teachers, certainly in Scotland, are middle class, often in religion, and of course also in age, unless we're talking about research with language minority and ethnic minority teachers. So there is a clear difference in who the researchers are and who the researched are that goes beyond the usual difference in terms of power differentials and academics and other communities. So what are the issues then? Well, one of the issues that comes out of what I've said is that there's been, in many ways, not too much research, because we can never know too much, we can never understand too much, but many of the communities have been over-researched. The same communities are being asked to respond to all the different forms of research. Scotland's not a huge country, so the same schools keep getting approached. Oh, they're good, they'll work with you. So you keep going back to the same schools. The same community organisations and NGOs keep going back to for research. There is an over-research which can lead to something of a feeling of not actually being taken seriously. Somebody else has asked you those questions, you think, if you don't know the answers and you're not acting on it already, what's the point of going on here? And I'm talking here and also through the rest of my talk about qualitative research, about research with people, about responsive research, and I'm not talking about large-scale quantitative research. There's also an issue here about homogenising the experience. Let's look at the Roma community in Glasgow and then say that all Roma behave in this way, all Roma experience education in this way, and so on. There's an instrumental approach to data, which is just looking for the answer to one particular question without being able to see what else is in the data, and an essentialization of minority groups as performing in one particular way and having one particular reaction and response. And what that often means is that key issues for the communities being researched are missed, they're not seen. Researchers cannot see the wood for the trees, to use a cliche. They can't really see what's going on because they have their particular questions and are not involving the communities in what the questions really are. Often the research instruments are invalid, they're culturally inappropriate, they don't consider the ways of communication and the norms of family life. The data is often erroneously analysed, as I said, missing out what the key issues are. And clearly when we look at who makes up the researchers and who makes up the researched, there's linguistic and cultural power imbalance going on there as well. So I want to try and draw from some other disciplines, some other professions, and see what we can learn from there, but also what can we learn from other educational work that's gone on, particularly in the area of culturally responsive pedagogy. And then, as I said, draw from 3 of my own projects to look at ways that I've tried to overcome the issues, but certainly haven't overcome them. I mentioned earlier that we used to have an interdisciplinary module in the university where we worked together with all the other professions being educated at the university. And much of the work that we were doing was of a similar nature with just a very slightly different orientation and research questions. So for me it is particularly appropriate to look at professions such as social work, psychology and nurse educators, which is the next one I'll be looking at. And there has been a lot of discussion from social work. Look at a most recent work from Casado, Negi and Tong, looking at culturally responsive research practices. And culturally responsive is a word that in education, a term in education that many of us are used to thinking about how we need to think about the variety of pedagogies, a pedagogy that is appropriate for a range of different cultural practices and linguistic practices and backgrounds. And they're writing specifically about culturally responsive research practices with language minorities and how to overcome the language power differential that often exists. Also from 2012 in psychology, Lyons and et al. Were writing about research in Africa and discussing the way in which cultural values and norms need to be taken into account, not just in the instruments that are used, but right from the very start, from thinking about what it is that's being investigated. Is this something that it is appropriate culturally to investigate with this particular group? To also thinking about who is actually in your research team. If you're researching in a linguistically and culturally minority situation, is it appropriate that your research team is made up totally of those from a majority linguistic and ethnic background, right through to the analysis of the data? So it's not just thinking about the instruments, but all aspects of the design of a project need to be taken into account. And in nursing science, and this is going back a bit, but I think Milace's criteria for what she calls culturally competent research are still very relevant, and we need to think about them. And contextuality being a very important one, is the context that you're working in the appropriate one to gather the data, to answer the questions that you're looking for. If you're looking at educational experiences, does it necessarily mean that you should only be working in the context of the school? Or can you look outside the school at the educational experiences that children are having elsewhere that are often ignored in research with minority groups? How relevant is the research to the community? Do they want these particular answers? Or are you just doing something that somebody has already asked before, over and over again, and you may be doing it in a slightly different way? Can you consult with communities and find out what they need answers to? What kind of style are you using for your communication? Are you using the same style that you would use with majority language speakers? Or have you thought about communication style? Do you need to use the oral, or can you use the visual? Can you use first language and translators? What are the issues that are around that? Being very aware as researchers of issues around differences in identity and also differences in power. Being very clear about what you're actually going to do with the research and how people that you're researching with are perhaps going to be made more vulnerable by the research being done. Making sure that the researched gets something back from the research. And it's something that is easily said, oh, this research will be valuable for you, it will enhance your experience, but will it really? Will the policy change if all the policy comes from the OECD anyway? What impact will our research have? Geri's made a great effort in this conference to make sure that there is some give back to local communities in terms of social justice, and I think it's something that we all need to think about in our research. Can the research we talk, and I have done this myself, can talk quite glibly about empowering the researched, but is the research actually in any way going to empower? And what is the nature of that power? Is it a transitory feeling of power, or is it going to lead to real agency and real opportunity to change? And Milace also talks about the need for time, and this is certainly something that I would highlight, is that time cannot be minimized. If you're really going to empower and reciprocate and be aware, then you need to give the time to do that. But I think we can also look at our own discipline of education and think, if from social work there's talk about culturally responsive research, what can we learn from culturally responsive pedagogy? I'm not going to read out the quotes because fortunately you can now all see the slides. Most of you, because you're at a conference related to social justice, equity and diversity in education, are going to be familiar with culturally responsive pedagogy. But the one that I would point you to particularly is the final one from Ophelia Garcia and Tuvas Gutenab Kangas and Doris Guzman. exert educational effort. And I think that would be one of the key things, is if you are doing research with linguistically and ethnically diverse populations, exert research effort. Don't just think, oh, I know how to do that. I've been researching for years. I've done X million questionnaires and X thousand interviews and focus groups. I know what I'm doing. Exert research effort to take into account the diversity of languages and cultural practices that you're going to be engaging with. And then I move to the work of Jim Cummins, who'll be known to many of you as a guru in bilingual education particularly, but also in culturally responsive pedagogy. And he is drawing from Freire here in thinking about how to create a transformative education for linguistic and cultural minorities. And this is a summary of his work where he looks at how the orientation of educational practitioners, teachers, can lead to either students who are empowered, both academically and personally, or to students who are resistant to education. Pointer's not working either. I'm at the bottom right of the columns. Resistant to education, and there are academic barriers to their education. So down the left-hand side, he looks at the orientation that teachers have to incorporating cultures and languages, and how that can be a recognition that cultures and languages bring added value to experience, and that they are added into what goes on in the classroom. Or it can be, on the right-hand side, an exclusionary orientation. Unfortunately, despite the rhetoric of social justice in Scotland, I would say that cultural and linguistic incorporation is, for the majority of the time, still excluded, and one is expected to assimilate into English language and into the educational norms and values of Scottish education. And therefore, despite what the Inspectorate and the Scottish Government would say, unfortunately, I think we do have a subtractive orientation to cultural and linguistic incorporation. He then looks at community participation, and are communities involved, are parents involved, are community school organisations involved, are NGOs involved, are all these bodies excluded from education? He looks at the pedagogy, the form of teaching, and does it advocate for cultural and linguistic minorities, or does it attempt to legitimise failure and say, well, we'll do our best for them, we'll make sure that they have a good time while they're here, but they've not got the language of the classroom, so it's going to be hard. And he also looks at assessment, and again, is here using the language of Freire. Is the assessment one that enables transformation, or is it one that is just banking, is just putting in what needs to be known, teaching to the test all the time? And argues that depending on the orientation, that will lead to particular outcomes for students. I use Cummins' model to come to the model of research that I'm proposing at the end. I want to give you an example of what I think culturally responsive pedagogy looks like in practice. Some people that have seen me talk before will have seen these particular photos because they're very dear to me, because they do represent culturally responsive pedagogy in action that I hope you can see immediately. They're photos from one of the research projects I undertook with newly arrived refugee pupils in Scotland. And on the left-hand side of this photograph is a 12-year-old girl who arrived from the Democratic Republic of Congo about 2 months before the photograph was taken. And in her hand, she's holding the first story that she's ever written in English. And it's been, she wrote the story based on a traditional Indian folk story. but turned it into her own version of that story, word processed it, illustrated it, and then published it in a book. And the teacher thought that it would be a good idea for the older pupils to read their stories to the younger pupils. That's not the culturally responsive bit. The culturally responsive bit is what the pupil is doing. She's really, really proud of this story that she's just written in English. It is the first story that she's ever written in English. And she's reading her story there to a 6-year-old girl who arrived from the same country, the Democratic Republic of Congo, the day before this photo was taken. As I said, she was really proud of writing this story in English because it was a big goal to be able to be literate in English. But she wasn't reading the story in English. She was telling the story in French. And I said to her, why did you tell the story to this girl in French? And she said, she laughed and she said, she doesn't know English yet, but she knows French. And many teachers don't use that yet. They'll just start with, she's got no English. Or worse still, I have heard many times, she's got no language. But this 12-year-old girl was able to say, she doesn't know English yet, but she knows French, and was able to tell the story immediately responding to that in French. Even more than that. Here she is again telling the story to another girl, also from the Democratic Republic of Congo, but this girl has actually been, the girl with the glasses, who is 8 years old, has actually been in Scotland at the time of this photo for about 9 months, so a lot longer than the older girl. And she's actually, she's doing really well in a Scottish classroom. She is achieving English literacy very quickly. But the older girl, again, didn't read the story in English, nor did she tell the story in French. And she was telling the story in a language that I didn't know what it was. And I said to her, which language were you using when you were telling the story to this girl? I said, oh, that was Lingala. I said, oh, and why did you use Lingala? I did Lingala because it's her best language. So here we have a 12-year-old girl that just like that can decide what is the most appropriate language to use with these learners, and can use that language and can justify using that language. And that, to me, is culturally responsive pedagogy. So the 3 research projects I'm going to say a bit about, one was funded by the UK-based Economic and Scientific Research Council on investigating school pupils' views on diversity. One was funded by the European Union on investigating refugee pupils' creative responses to education, and Dennis, who's at the back, was involved in that project. And the third one was funded by the Scottish Government. So we've got EU, UK and Scottish projects here. And the Scottish Government one wasn't working with pupils, it was working with teachers who had arrived in Scotland having fled persecution in their country of origin. They'd been teachers in their country of origin and wanted to become teachers in Scotland. And I'm going to present little bits of data from each of the projects, trying to explain how I tried to overcome some of the barriers that there were, as I highlighted before, and the kinds of data that resulted from that, and the kinds of issues that arose out of the data, and then look at how to get more out of the data, and also what some of the barriers were that I didn't manage to overcome. So the first one was looking at pupils' understandings of diversity, linguistic, cultural, ethnic diversity. And we decided that we wanted to try and overcome the power differential by not having adults present when the children were speaking. So we used something called open space technology, which enabled the children to have conversations on their own around topics of their own, that they created their own agenda for discussion. They recorded their discussions, and then we as adults attempted to analyse those discussions. And this was a group of 8 children aged between 10 and 14 who decided they wanted to discuss racism. I'm only showing you this as one tiny, tiny extract from a huge amount of data because I want to draw some issues out of it. So we were trying to overcome this barrier of the power differential, trying to give space to the researched in this instance. And this was at the very start of the conversation, and one of the pupils had said, "What are we talking about then? It's about racism. What's it all about?" And a pupil responded, "Well, we're all the same, except we're different." Now, when we were listening to that as adults, we thought, a teacher has said that at some point. We're all the same, but we're different. Let's celebrate our difference. But a second pupil responded to that and said, "How does that work? We're not different at all." And a third pupil said, and they're still trying to work out, what do we mean by racism? And the third pupil said, I mean, it's, and when she said it's, she meant racism. It's not just white people ganging up on coloured people. It can be coloured people ganging up on white people as well. And then she addressed another child who was a minority ethnic pupil in the group and said, "No offence, as in, I don't mean you gang up on white people." And that child said, "Yeah, I know. And then the girl who'd said, "No offence," seemed to want to continue this and said, "It's not as if you do it anyway. It's not as if you do racism." Now, I'm just showing you this to show you the kind of data that resulted from handing over the discussion topic and the recording power, because they could switch on and off as they wished, to the young people. And some of the things that came up for us there were that there was a real attempt to de-racialize racism. And so it's not just white people. Black people do it too, and that came through in a number of the discussions. And it's not about race, it's because everybody does it. There was also attempts in that bit of data to where there were others who were known, they were okay, they were legitimized. So no offense, I don't mean you do it, but there was definitely an avoidance of naming racism and naming black versus white. So it was coloured people. And another extract from the same conversation was, I don't want to say it, but like different skin colour. And the young people did not have the language to talk about racism, which suggests to me that they weren't being equipped with that language in the classrooms, and that the teachers didn't feel empowered to talk about racism either. So the pros and cons of that approach that we took, well, definitely we did give voice to the young people. They could talk about what they wanted. They could switch on and off the recorder. They could choose what they wanted us to hear. The choice of topics, the length of time that they talked, the length of time that they were involved in the conversation, because they could get up and leave if they wanted, was totally controlled by the young people. So to an extent, they did have agency over what was said. And we have evidence from what they said to us and wrote to us afterwards that they did enjoy the experience and they did feel that they'd learned from the experience. So there was some evidence of reciprocity. But the difficulties with it, it was really difficult for us listening to the recordings, which were audio only, not visual, So you could say, well, how do you know who was talking? And it's just because there were some of the children I knew and I recognised their voices. It was very difficult for us as researchers to know who was speaking and who was controlling the conversation, who were the lead players, who was taking the power when the adults weren't there. And there were very definitely young people that were taking power, taking control. As you might imagine, in any group of people, be they young people or adults, talking about an issue, you don't necessarily stay on topic the whole time. So there was a lot of off-topic talk in the recordings. And it's really hard to deal with that as data. Do you decide as the researcher that's irrelevant? In which case, are you then negating that you've given voice and agency to the young people? Or do you decide that is relevant and then have to work out how on earth you analyse the discussion that is around clothes, food, music, television, and nothing to do with the topic that you want them to talk about? So it wasn't the answer to everything, but it is one way of thinking about giving over control. Yuri, I will need an indication of time at some point, okay? Or I'll just talk on and on. In the EU-funded project, looking at creative responses of newly arrived migrant pupils to Scotland, decided that because of the linguistic difference, where I as a researcher spoke English and French, and many of the pupils from Francophone West Africa also spoke French, but many of the pupils in the school were from other countries, and I didn't share any of their languages. I decided to use digital photography. And many researchers have used photography, and now many people use digital photography. I think frequently researchers still use, when they think about using cameras, they think, well, we'll use disposable cameras because they're cheap. And I would argue against using disposable cameras because the product is also fixed. Whereas with digital photography, it allows the photographer to manipulate the photographs before they come to the researcher. Again, we could talk a long time about digital photography and the benefits of digital photography and the problems and the expectations of what you take photos of. But in this project, we used digital photography. And the pupils worked in collaborative research groups of 4 pupils, 2 who were newly arrived refugee pupils, and 2 who had been educated for all of their 10 to 11 years of their life in Scotland. And the pupils had to take photographs of things around the school that interested them and that they wanted to talk about. And then they had to turn their photographs into slideshows with annotations. And the annotations could be in any language, but usually the pupils chose to annotate in English. And this particular photograph is the door of a classroom. And on the door is a poster that says welcome in several different languages. And it's a poster, a kind of poster that many of you may have seen. Could be called tokenistic way of celebrating linguistic diversity by putting a welcome poster in lots of languages on the door of the classroom. But to this 11-year-old Algerian boy, it was a very important token, because his annotation to this photo was that when he arrived in the school, I thought only English people were here. And then he saw his language, and he pointed to Arabic, and where it said Assalamu alaikum, and he read it out, and he was really, really pleased to see his language. His seeing of his language was enhanced when you realise that although he was Algerian and Arabic was his home language and his preferred language, his education had been in French. And his first language had not been his language of education. So he was particularly pleased to see Arabic on the door of this classroom. did lead to some false expectations, however, that perhaps the teacher might speak Arabic, which he quickly realised wasn't the case. So in terms of the digital photography, again, the young people had control. They could choose what they took photos of. They could manipulate the photos. They could decide themselves how to interpret those photos. And they only gave me the ones they wanted me to see. Digital photography, again, you can take millions of photos and you can choose the 6 or 7 that you want the researcher to actually see. And you can print out the others and keep them or give them to your friends or whatever. It was a very collaborative project, and it built the collaboration between the newly arrived children from asylum-seeking families and the long-term pupils in the school. So it did have benefits for that. It was also very enjoyable for the pupils, and they learned new skills. And I'm not just talking about using a camera, because now most children can take photos with a phone, with a digital camera, but talking about manipulating, using Photoshop, turning into slideshows, annotating, and so on. So there was a lot of reciprocity and give back to the pupils. Barriers, though, time. There was a huge amount of time needed for the analysis because there was so many layers of data. ARC. You know, when Yuri told me the amount of time that I had, I said, I'll never be able to speak for that amount of time. And he's now just told me I've got 5 minutes left, so I better try and get to the point. But there was also an issue in that the children didn't really have power. And the school, in this case, kept the cameras and used it as a kind of bargaining position. If you finish all your work, you can go and do some of Geri's research. No, you can't take photos just now because I haven't got time to go and look for the camera. And so the schools kept control over the tool that was being used. The third project was the refugee teachers. And with this, what we really wanted to do was make sure that the teachers themselves were involved in the project team. Many of them, they were all teachers, but many of them had master's degrees and doctoral degrees. And we wanted to benefit from their research skills, but also from their understanding of teaching in their own countries. And so they were very involved in designing the interview schedules that we were using, and then subsequently in analysing the data. And this is just 2 extracts from the data that we received from them. And you'll see they were very focused on talking about being teachers and the identity of teaching, and trying to overcome the identity that had been put upon them since arriving in the UK of now you're an asylum seeker, and eventually if the UK government decides you can be a refugee, but that's what you are, that's your new identity. And the data was very much, it was, no, I'm a teacher and that's what my identity is. Benefits of this participatory research were very definitely that we overcame that over-research issue, because the team recognised the value of the research and they trusted each other and the rest of the team. And the refugee teachers did have agency, did have ownership of the research, the whole process. And so we got some very meaningful data out of it. Again, though, it was a very time-consuming process because the interviews went on and were repeated, and it was wonderful, but the funding was finite. And we got a lot of after-the-fact data, because as the teachers themselves analysed the interview data, they added more to it. And so we had to be thinking, well, when does the data collection actually stop? It hadn't set up to be an ethnographic project. It didn't have the funding to be a long-term project. But what could we not count? Was there anything that didn't count? I'm realising the time and not going to be able to give the amount of time I wanted to this. But I think subsequently becoming much more aware of intersectionality as a lens for looking at the data. And intersectionality grew out of the Black American feminist movement, but is now being utilised as a research lens much more. But Davis has talked about intersectionality as being the interaction between gender, race, and other categories of difference, and how these interactions have specific outcomes in terms of power. And so we're trying now in our research grouping to look at how structural inequalities are generated by these interactions of race, class, gender, language, and so on, with the recognition that if we focus only on individuals or on what we try and put together as homogeneous groups, we are not being effective in our analysis of the data. So I'll try and quickly do this, but in this first piece of data that I showed you, it's important to say that pupil 3 was a white female. She wasn't just one other pupil. She was white, she was female, and she was 3 years older than male pupil 4. That she said, you know, no offence, I don't mean you, you don't do it. And pupil 3 was at secondary school. So there was very definitely issues there around who had the power, who had the control in this conversation, and how did they utilise that control with the younger male pupil from a language minority, from a different religious background, and at primary school. In this particular piece of data, as I said, the pupil was a refugee from Algeria, but his focus wasn't on his refugeness, it was on linguistic diversity, and it was in the importance of his Arabic being recognised rather than the enforced Francophone education that he'd had in Algeria. I apologise for the rush here, but I'm trying to get through it. In the third piece of data, which I already had rushed, it's important to know that both of these teachers that spoke here were male. And they're both actually secondary teachers, one from the Democratic Republic of Congo, one from Congo-Brazzaville. And when we started to look at the data in this way, we actually saw the very different ways in which the males were talking about their experience and the females were talking about their experience, and the way they were talking about the need to be a teacher in Scotland, as opposed to the need to be secure and to have refugee status and to have citizenship and to have security for their family, which came from a lot of the female respondents. Again, I would have said more about that if I'd had time. So, trying to develop from Jim Cummins' work on culturally responsive pedagogy, I've tried to put together here a model for culturally responsive research. And what I'm trying to say is that the way that the institutions, as opposed to the individual researchers, the way the research institutions, be they the universities, the schools, a combination of both, and the minority group communities that are being researched, there needs to be collaborative relations of power manifested right from the start between those. So the universities need to be much more outward looking, as Yuri is demonstrating in this conference. And that should hopefully lead to groups, minority groups, linguistic and cultural minority groups who are able to articulate, who are empowered and who do feel confident. And the way those initial macro relations of power are set up will inform how the researchers themselves define what their role is in relation to the researched and what kind of research structures are going to be appropriate. And that will lead to the micro interactions between the researchers and the researched having a transformative intercultural orientation to the research, recognising the added value of incorporating cultural and linguistic diversity and of involving the community as participants, thinking about the methodology, thinking about the analysis, and leading to respondents, be they pupils or teachers from linguistic and cultural minorities who are personally and professionally empowered. As I said, you'll get the slides, so I won't go into what I mean by each of those terms. I'll have to leave them for you to look at the slides or to ask about in questions. And I want to finish up with a quote from in a more recent research project where we were looking at the experiences of teachers in Scotland who are from culturally, ethnically and linguistic minority populations, not part of the Scottish English-speaking white majority of teachers. And Caitlin, who is a black British primary teacher, said that she was talking about her experience and said that she's become inured to some individuals' general ignorance of how to talk comfortably about diversity, black and minority ethnic populations, which is BME, and the underlying issues of power and perspectives which create the necessity for a deeper debate on the complexities of our society and its continuing challenges of inequality. So she's kind of fed up with people not being able to talk about race, not being able to talk about power, not being able to talk about inequality. And she says that rather than people being worried and thinking that they might not be using the right words, I'd rather people opened their mouths so that conversations could deepen and we could move along the debate at a faster pace. And I haven't finished the slides, but I'm going to finish there before I get cut off or the microphone gets shut down, and hope that we can open our mouths and deepen the conversations and move the debate along at a faster pace as Caitlin would wish. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Geri. And you can say even the other things that were missing, maybe answering the questions. So we have a bit more time. And so if you have questions, comments, please, the floor is yours.
I was very curious. I was very interested actually when I saw those photographs when children were talking. Just one example. My grandma lived in part of town where most of the residents were Hungarian. And when we played in some houses, then when elders wanted to talk for themselves, something that isn't for our ears, they would switch to speak to Hungarian. So then we felt like it's time to leave the room. So the language that we use in institutions are somewhat different from those in families. Maybe like methodologies could be in a way to find out the language in the families. Maybe that's the future for future maybe redirection for those researchers. Just a simple comment. Yeah. Thank you.
So I'll just try and give a simple answer. And there has been a lot of research done across the globe, but talking about UK research, there's been a lot of research done at the Institute of Education in London by Eve Gregory and Sharman Kenner and their team, looking at the use of languages in families, looking at the way in which language and literacy develops across generations, particularly looking at the way in which grandparents communicate with children and help literacy and language practices to develop. And I was only talking about some of the pieces of work that I've done, but I think you're absolutely right. But I think the other thing to take out of your comment is that it's easy for researchers to make assumptions about what is the dominant language of the household, when in fact that is not the dominant language. And when you get up to speak there, I thought you were going to comment on something akin to colleagues of mine in Slovenia, where I have a colleague and friend who lives in the south of Slovenia, in a 4-generation family, and her grandmother went to school when Slovenia was part. Now, I'm not sure if I get the history right here, but I'll get the languages right, but maybe not the order. Her grandmother went to school when Slovenia was part of the Italian community, and so the language of education was Italian. The mother went to school when Slovenia was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and German was the language of education. My colleague went to school when Slovenia was part of Yugoslavia, and Serbo-Croat was the language of education. And her daughter now goes to school in an independent Slovenia, where Slovenian is the language of education. But Slovenian remains the home language. But researchers could make assumptions about which language usages there were in the family. And you're absolutely right, you cannot only look at the educational experience in the school setting. You have to go much wider than that and far beyond that to really get what's going on.
Thanks very much for that talk, Geri. I am also quite interested in the use of photography as a research methodology, and I like the participatory side of it, and the handing the control over to the participants to, provide images of their world and to explain their lives. The difficulty I have with it is the next step is that it's often reliant on the person who took the photograph to explain in a language, or to write why they chose this photograph or what it means to them. And I noticed when you were explaining about the digital photography that the students had to put captions on the photographs to kind of explain it. I wonder if you had considered just using the photographs alone as the data, and analysing just what is present in the images that they give you, rather than falling back onto a language explanation.
Yeah, thanks, Max. I think that photography is a very attractive methodology for people. And people think, well, we can get away from language by using image. And it's digital photography lends itself, as I said, to being manipulated. But ultimately, analysis lies in the hands of the analysers, the researchers. And so I think you have to consider some way of involving the research in the analysis. I have used photography alone. And for me, you mentioned there, can you analyse the photos and what's present in the photos without the language? And using photography alone, often for me, what's more important is what's absent in the photos, and looking at grouping the things that people feel able to take photos of and the things that they don't feel able to take photos of. And also to look at who else is present invisibly in the photograph. And I think very often photographs taken by children, the researcher or the teacher is present, even though they're not in the photo. And you can tell the photos that have been taken in order to please the expectations of the researcher or the teacher. And so you have to be able to build that into your analysis as well. Who are the invisible present in the photos? What and who are absent from the photos? I think you can analyse photographs without text. The reason for using text in that was so that the collaborative groups of 4 pupils could work together to construct the slideshow that they wanted to give to other pupils, and could help them to understand without having to give oral explanations. They didn't have to stand up in front of a group like this and talk about their photos, but could purely show the collaborative text that they'd come up with, whether that was in English or in another language of the group that they were using. And I think the main thing about photography is don't think it's an easy option. It's
on a yearly basis from next year, we will have about 2,000 teachers preparing at undergraduate and postgraduate primary school level. That's not to mention masters, doctoral students, and social workers, psychologists, and even dentists and dentistry students who are wanting to get access to schools. We have about 3,000 schools, many of which are uninteresting, to be polite, in research terms. And I mean that in the context of most researchers are not going to go. So we're going to have the vast majority of our students who are looking to undertake research trying to get access to a very small number of schools, and some of them trying to get access to a tiny minority of schools. I think there are huge ethical issues here in terms of researching a captive audience, but also in terms of saturation. How do you overcome that when the policy is moving towards ensuring that this must take place in order to get teacher accreditation? There may be a good rationale for it, but I'm not sure it's properly thought out, and certainly the structural issues haven't been worked out.
Yeah, it's a really valid question, Rory, and I think the move to master's level education is happening in a lot of places, and so there are going to be similar issues around saturation of research. I think it's incredibly important that teachers at an undergraduate level are equipped with research skills. But I don't think that that means you have to conduct empirical research in a classroom, because your empirical research as an undergraduate could be pretty flawed. But what you can do is, and something that we're trialling at Strathclyde is what we're calling, we have used a term that's started at Georgia Tech, vertically integrated projects, where undergraduates are joining postgraduate students and academic staff to work on research projects. So I have my fourth year undergraduate students working with me on my research project, rather than trying to create their own small-scale research project that could be very flawed and that could just tire schools out with, oh no, I've got another student in doing research. And the vertical integration is good for me because I've got more research assistants to work with me. It's good for the early career researchers in my team who can start to develop their skills of teaching to the undergraduate students. And it's good for the undergraduate students because they're seeing what research really is, as opposed to this kind of short, quick, let's see how X, Y, and Z in this class are responding to the maths questions for the next 4 weeks and what I make out of that. So that would be one solution, would be bringing undergraduates into research teams. But it takes structural change. It can't just be done by one person. It needs to be an institutional change that's done. And we have got funding from Research Councils UK to develop this particular approach. But I think developing research skills, while empirical research, of course, is vitally important, I think that undergraduate students can also be encouraged to work with secondary data. They can be encouraged to do an awful lot more research reading and understand how research is constructed, what research design can look like. They can create research projects without conducting empirical research. And I think you're right, there are a lot of ethical issues around small-scale undergraduate research projects, and research saturation is only one of them. But flaws in design, I think, is one that can be prolific if it's not managed properly. So yeah, there are ways around it.
Thank you for that.
I would like to share something with you. In Croatia, we have 3 models for minority education on their own language. We have model A. You have all the classroom on your minority language, and a teacher supposed to be the minority nationality teacher. On the model B, you listen only social sciences subjects on the language of the minority, and on the model C, you have something about like election subjects about your nationality, culture, and so on. And what's the problem in Croatia? Parents have the right to choose Model A to have education for their child on the minority language, even if there is only one child supplied for that program. So what happens? We have classrooms in primary schools, for example, near Osijek, you know, for our problems between Serbs and Croatians. And parents, I would say they discriminate their own child. He goes alone in a classroom without classmates, and the only interaction in school that he has is his teacher. And what problems we have? They even insist that, you know, we have a Latin letter and Cyrillic letter in Serbs. Cyrillic letters is like in Russian, you probably all know. And parents wanted their children to write English in that letter. So what do you think? We have also a cultural Hungarian center in Osijek. They have a nursery school, they have a primary school, secondary school, and 5 years ago when I had research for my PhD, I gave them questionnaires on Croatian languages. And the pupils from gymnasium, they didn't understand the questions on Croatian language, and they live in Croatia. And we have that problems, they are like some ghettos. What do you think about, is it good for that children? To have a class on their language and they don't have any social interactions with the minority and others nationalities.
There's been long-term, long-scale, longitudinal research done in the States by Virginia Thomas and Wayne Collier, looking at what is the most effective model of education for language minority students. And they've been doing the research for 25 years now. I think there's been about 150,000 minority language students involved in the research. It's very in-depth and it's quite conclusive. The title of one of their research reports is The Astounding Effectiveness of Dual Language Education. And they show quite clearly that the outcomes, not only in terms of academic achievement, but in terms of confidence, self-esteem, well-being, and so on, are hugely enhanced for those pupils who are learning in both languages concurrently. The majority language of the country and the first language. They looked at around 12 different models, although they cut it down into 6 models, from English only through what you're explaining of the immersion in the home language, and found that absolutely the effects were best where it was dual language education. And that research has been replicated on a much smaller scale across the globe, and dual language education is seen to be the most effective. And whereas in Scotland, I do strongly recommend recognition of first language in the classroom, use of first language in the classroom. There is no dual language or bilingual education in Scotland, unfortunately, apart from Gaelic. Gaelic is one of the heritage languages of Scotland, and there is bilingual education in Gaelic. The programme that is used for that is the first 3 years of education are in Gaelic only, and then from year 4 it moves into dual language education. And even in the small scale dual language education there, it's shown that the pupils are achieving beyond monolingual pupils in maths, science, and also in English as well, of course, as in Gaelic. So I think the answer is, on the one hand, it's great that Croatia provides first language education, but it's not going to lead to the best results in any measures unless both languages are used.
Thank you very much, Geri. Unfortunately, we have to cut here. And yes, and you wanted to advertise. Yeah, that's
I was waiting for the last question to advertise, but there's no more questions, so I'll just do it. The end of next month, the 28th to the 30th of May, we're having a conference at the University of Strathclyde, Diverse Teachers for Diverse Learners. We're an international research network that have had funding from the EU and from Nordforsk, which is the Nordic Research Council, and we've now got a research network established through the World Education Research Association. A number of people that are in the audience are coming to that conference and presenting papers at it. What we're looking at is ethnic, cultural and linguistic diversity in the teaching profession and best responses to ethnic, cultural and linguistic diversity in school populations. We've got over 40 papers from 15 different countries, and we're really excited that the papers are coming from 4 different continents. So we see that this is a global issue, and we'd be delighted to welcome more participants at the conference. So again, anybody that is interested, you can speak to me over the course of the next couple of days. Thanks, Geri.
And thank you for the presentation. This is a small present for you. Thank you. There are some books